My name is David Vose, and I'm the Vice President of Risk Management at Archer. My talk today is about which risks a business should focus on. So let me share screen with you. Okay. This is a picture of me when I was born, my mother and father and our dog Max. I was born in 1962, so I'm 59 years old. This is another picture of me on my first birthday, cute little picture with me and Teddy Bear, Big Ted, I called him when I was a bit older. My first birthday, you can see in the background, there's a little one there, little birthday cards. It looks very cute, but it's actually quite an ominous picture because you will also see that this is a hospital bed and there's a couple of nurses in the background. I got this enormously expensive teddy bear, which, by the way, I still keep, because it was expected to be my only birthday. I was suffering from nephrotic syndrome, which means that there was something wrong with my kidneys and nobody knew what it was. But thankfully, after the Second World War, the United Kingdom, where I was born, decided to create the National Health Service. And I stayed in this hospital in that bed for 9 months in my first year of life at zero cost to my family, which was good because my family were not very wealthy. I tell you this because this represents one person in a trend that has been going on since 1962 in the child mortality rates have been dropping and dropping and dropping, which is an enormous testament to the health advancements that we've made in the last half century. You can see that I was born in a very lucky place in the United Kingdom. 1962 is just 3% child mortality, meaning children dying before the age of 5, whereas in Africa it's way over 25%, terrible figure. And you can see that as up to 2019, these numbers have been dropping and dropping. At the same time, because those numbers have been dropping, the number of children per woman has also been dropping because they didn't have their children dying. You can see that it's fairly stable in most of the world. In Africa, in very, very particular, it's dropped from nearly 7 children per woman down to somewhere around about 4.5, which again is a great testament to the distribution of healthcare across the world. But you can still see that there is a great deal of difference. At the same time, the life expectancy of people has been increasing. You can see that for me, back there in 1962, my life expectancy would have been about just under 70 years. It's now sitting around somewhere around 82. And for every part of the world, this is increasing, including in Africa, which was down at a very miserable 40-odd years, but now sits somewhere around 65. Again, you see these strong differences. Well, the end result of all of that is that the population has been increasing. So back when I was born, population was somewhere around 3 billion people, a bit over 3 billion. We're now at somewhere 7.5 billion, something like that. It's over double what it was when I was born. This is not really due to Europe or North or South America. It is mostly due to Asia, which is now flattening off. If we look at the birth rates and we look at life expectancy, we see that this number is not going to increase that much more. But in Africa, it is expected to increase a lot. So most of the driving of the population increase is going to be coming from Africa in the future. Now, there are two parts to a population increase that drive it. One is the control of health. The other one is the availability of food. And we've made great progress, slightly inverted commas, for this too. So the amount of arable land that is required to produce a certain amount of food has dropped from what it was in 1962 to roughly about half, all across the world of what it was before. Now, that doesn't come without some penalties. So 1962, when I was born, and even I remember, as a child being driven around in cars, pig farms looked like that. So pigs would sit under these shelters and have their babies, their piglets. And pig farms now look like this. And egg-producing farms look like that, and they now look like this. And there's a lot associated with that. There's a lot of disease, there's a lot of very concentrated pollutions, etc. 3 other graphs I want to show you. On the left-hand side, we have GDP per capita. You can see that the United States here is way above anybody else, but France is as a representation of Europe. France is something around 80%, 70% of what the United States is. GDP per capita represents really how much we can consume, the stuff we end up buying. And then the things we end up buying are the things that end up exhausting resources in the world, and they end up polluting. You can see that China is on the rise. China's middle class is increasing, and you can see that India and Africa, Zimbabwe representing Africa here, they're very far behind. Again, an enormous discrepancy, greater discrepancy than anything else we've seen so far. Now, you can imagine that these regions of the world, they aspire to having the same GDP per capita, the same wealth as the United States. And you can imagine that the United States and Europe, they don't really want to get rid of or reduce the amount of wealth that they have. They only want to make it grow. So we have kind of a problem, because not only is our population increasing, but we're also going to see that their consumption rates are going to get larger and larger. We're also ending up eating more. So the meat supply per person is going up. In the United States, not so much, because they already had quite a lot of it. But you can see for other parts of the world, Brazil has gone up a bit, but China back in the 60s, extremely poor country, and remembering that there are over 1 billion people, they now have a much higher amount of meat consumption per capita than they ever did before. And Africa's pretty much flat. At the same time, with seafood, we can see a trend here where the production of fish caught at sea, or rivers, this has increased but now stabilized, flattened out largely because there really aren't enough fish in the sea for us to fish. It's getting harder and harder to find them. So we've replaced that with aquaculture. And aquaculture is an enormous pollutant. This is primarily in the Asian region, but you can see the amount of aquaculture has gone up absolutely astonishingly, and it's just exponentially rising. I mention all of these things because it brings some context to where I come from and where the world is ending up heading. Human effects on the planet are very complex, and I just want to give you one kind of simple example of this. Here we have this beautiful creature, the North Atlantic right whale. There are less than 95 breeding females left on the planet. They live in the northeast coast of the United States. They eat this thing here, it's Calanus finmarchicus, which is a copepod. It's about 3 millimeters long, kind of extraordinary that a creature this huge would eat things so tiny. This is a staple diet of the right whale, but also of cod and herring and a number of other redfish. We're also fishing this. We're fishing it more and more because, unfortunately for this little copepod, it's very high in omega-3. Omega-3, everybody knows, has enormous health benefits. So we want to buy this stuff and be healthier. Well, it turns out that actually a recent Cochrane report shows that that's nonsense. Taking omega-3 pills has actually no identifiable health benefit whatsoever. At the same time, the temperature of the sea surface has been rising. And seeing as these little copepods like to live in quite cool waters, they've been moving north at a rate of about 8 kilometers per year. And of course, when they move north, so do the fish and so do the right whales. Right into the traffic of large vessels. This isn't actually a right whale. I couldn't find a picture of one, but they're being killed by being hit by tankers and other vessels. They're also coming into collision with fishing nets because of the cod and the herring who are being caught because they're also eating these copepods. And at the same time, we have all of the vortex collapsing from the propellers of these large vessels create a lot of noise. And that noise, we imagine, we're not sure, but we think that it stresses out the whales, and it also stops them from communicating, which means that these 95 breeding females are actually not doing a lot of breeding. But that could also be because of some of the polluting aspects of the sea from the runoffs from land, like acidification, etc. And because they have been disoriented by all these these ship noises, they also end up sometimes beached. So put it all together. What is the cause? Is it shipping? Fishing? Is it climate change? Is it acidification of the water and some other pollution? Is it education about omega-3 not actually being that valuable to us? Is it noise? What we tend to do is look at all of these risks from an individual perspective. We don't look at it as a collective, holistic problem. So the human impact on the planet is really complicated and it's really interconnected. We really have quite limited understanding and we have very limited predictive powers. We're used to looking in a risk register risks one at a time. We don't have any real analytical tools that will help us predict the risks of our effect on the environment because of the so many interconnecting moving parts. And essentially the best that we can do is to set targets on various things we can measure, which we know or expect are the drivers behind all of these changes to our planet. Essentially, what we're trying to do is prevent changes because when there are changes, it doesn't seem to be ever good. So, philosophical question perhaps, but why do large corporations exist? Well, one reason we could say they exist is that more resources concentrated together with great leadership can achieve greater things. We have the Airbus 380, the most energy efficient aircraft ever produced. We have enormous nuclear power stations which produce clean energy. We have rockets that rather miraculously can now go up into space and then come back down again. And we can construct really useful and sometimes quite beautiful useful structures for us to use. Of course, there are many other things. For vaccine production, and for COVID, you saw that because we have these large pharmaceutical companies, they can produce vaccines in what is an incredibly short time. We might have been impatient, but the achievement is incredible. The old way of looking at corporations is that their end goal was to provide wealth to its shareholders. But a newer way of looking at it is to provide prosperity to current and future societies. So this is a broader set of stakeholders than just simply the shareholders. And to be honest, the shareholders are mostly institutional shareholders anyways. They're either the insurance companies or the banks or the pension funds. And it's our money, you and me, that they are actually holding and are custodians of. How do we measure the impact of corporate activity? Well, there are a new evolving set of ideas about ESG, environmental and social governance. And along with those new ideas are coming a number of different rating methods, looking beyond the dollars and cents. And I just present two here, but there are many of them. I present two because if you look under the environmental side here, on the one hand, we've got the FTSE Russell ESG rating, where it's looking at biodiversity, climate change, pollution, resources, and water security. And I don't think that's a particularly good one as it's listed, because you can't really measure it. How do you measure biodiversity? You can't do that. How do you measure climate change as a corporation? You cannot. Pollution, resources, maybe to some degree. On the right-hand side, we see a different set. The energy efficiency and savings, this is something that is measurable. Recycling and resource efficiency, also measurable. And pollution monitoring, like the different pollutants that we're letting out into the environment, also measurable. So we have these different ESG rating scoring systems. They can take quite different philosophical approaches, and at the moment there is no one single standard. But having a good ESG rating is going to be critical for any business. First of all, it's compliance with regulations, which will be coming. We don't know what those regulations are yet, but you are going to need to comply with them. We will attract eco-friendly capital. So the sustainable investment market right now is over 1/3 of the managed assets, which is about 35 trillion in 2020, and it's rising. We're also going to attract customers because of our reputation. If we have a good ESG rating, probably we're going to have an ESG rating sitting on some of our products, certainly on our main websites. We will be flaunting it when we have a good ESG rating. We're going to attract customers, and because there will be more institutional investors who are going to want to invest with us, there will be a lower cost of debt. And of course, in parentheses, is just better for the planet. Nonetheless, it's going to be complicated. Like I said, the ESG disclosure standards are still being defined. We really don't know what they are. And for enormous, the data collection that we're going to need is something that we're not typically probably set up to do. There's going to be an enormous amount of data on things like energy consumptions and uses of buildings, and et cetera, et cetera. And we really need to start thinking about that now if you haven't already. We need to go further, though, because we need to think about third parties and fourth parties. It's all very well for us to be all clean and squeaky, but if we're using a third-party supplier who is an enormous pollutant, then this is going to come back and haunt us. And we also have some risk about greenwashing. It's important that we try to avoid any sense of cheating, like carbon offsets, etc., and pretending that we're green when we're really not. Let me give you an example of third-party risk here. This is an article in Reuters that was produced this week. Bitcoin soars to $50,000 again on institutional demand. Institutional demand being that banks are now getting in on Bitcoin. They're trading it, they're setting up advisory services, etc., around Bitcoin. This article was all about the increase in the market for these Bitcoins and who's getting involved and the money being made, etc. What it doesn't mention at all is the tragedy of Bitcoin, which is its environmental footprint. Here is something that I've screen capped out of digeconomist.net, Bitcoin energy consumption. It's an ongoing study, continuous study by the University of Cambridge. And I just want to point out a few figures here. The carbon footprint from the total Bitcoin generation. So Bitcoin is generated by mining. Mining is a computing activity. And it takes an awful lot of computing to generate a new Bitcoin. This is a new Bitcoin being generated is the benefit that the Bitcoin mining companies get by processing the transactions. So the more valuable the Bitcoin, the more people want to get in and do these transaction calculations. And the thing is that it's a race. It's the person who is the first to calculate the whole blockchain gets the money. So the bigger your processors are, the bigger your server farms are, the faster they can operate, the more money you will make. The carbon footprint from Bitcoin transaction calculations is comparable to that of Romania. Now, you might not be very familiar with Romania. Let's put it differently. The total electrical energy consumption, which I'm going to mention in a moment, is a bit different. The electric consumption is about 170 terawatt hours. That's the power consumption of Poland. Or you can say that 54% of the power consumption of Italy, just to generate these calculations. The electronic waste is 24 kilotons. That's electronic waste is the amount of processors that are being used and will expire in these huge server farms in order to produce these calculations. And that's a waste equivalent to the small IT equipment waste in the Netherlands. Okay, these are big numbers and it's not so easy to understand them. Let's look at an individual transaction. An individual transaction carbon footprint is equivalent to 1.9 million Visa transactions. So one transaction in a Bitcoin is equivalent to 1.9 million Visa transactions. The electrical energy consumption is equivalent to 62 days of US household, of an average US household. And these are not small consumers of electricity. That's for one transaction. And one transaction is also equivalent to the electronic weight of 1.6 odd iPhones or half of an iPad. The reason why we separate out the CO2 versus the electrical energy part, although you might think they're roughly equivalent, is because the electricity is generated in server farms that are set up where the cost of electricity, as you can imagine, is the lowest. And the cost of electricity where it's lowest is where you're using coal-fired power stations. So this is a much larger number than it should be for giving that amount of electricity. It's extraordinary to me that we have, on the one hand, institutional investors who are thinking, this is great, let's earn some money. And there is no commentary whatsoever about what the effect is on the planet. And this is really just a speculative investment. It has almost no genuine advantage to humankind. I just mentioned that as a third-party example, but there are many more of them. If you were, for example, I was reading in a newspaper yesterday that the Netherlands, the slaughter plants in the Netherlands have kind of a two employment system. One for the local people and one for the more itinerant workers. And the itinerant workers are paid a lower rate and have lower social security, and they work harder. And so if you're a supermarket who is buying these products from Dutch slaughter plants, you also need to think about those third-party risks. So that means ESG is not just about environmental, it's also about social, and there is a social inequality issue right there. The same thing for making clothes in sweatshops, etc. Now, how can risk management help with this? First thing is that you can think of risk management about helping to ensure the achievement of the strategic goals of a business. The only way that risk management is really going to help here is if we, first of all, for a corporation, define a broader set of strategic goals where we're not looking purely at the shareholders, but we're looking at that wider value of what is an enterprise. And the stakeholders, what is the stakeholder strategic goals? And the stakeholders you can think of as every man, you, me, our children, and our grandchildren. So what are the strategic goals of the business for the population? It sounds a little altruistic, but it is absolutely the way that we need to go. Once you define those broader strategic goals, then you need to define the tactics you're going to deploy in order to achieve those goals. Once you've done that, you then look at the threats in individual or aggregate that would make those tactics fail. ESG, environmental and social government risks, there are a number of them. First of all, there is compliance. One of the things I don't like about compliance is people always think of this as a rule. We have to be compliant. The point of these rules that we're meant to be following is that they're meant to be setting us guidelines on the things that we should be focusing on, not just simply the things that we have to, the rules we have to follow. So it's like a 50 kilometer an hour speed limit. Okay, that's the limit, that's the maximum you can go. But you know, if there are lots of children playing around, you shouldn't be going at 50 kilometers an hour. You have to use sense, and you have to think about what is really the intention of compliance. And I feel that that's one of the areas where business has really fallen short. It looks at compliance as sets of rules it must follow, but it doesn't look past it. It doesn't look at what we can do even more to try and be even better. And I've seen that in many different industries that I've worked in. One of the problems we're going to have with ESG is what we're seeing already. People, and it goes for governments too, on promises. We pledge that we're going to reduce our emissions and CO2 emissions by 2050 to X% or whatever, or we're going to be carbon neutral or whatever. There is promising it, and then there is showing it, showing how you're going to do it. And then the last bit is, how are we going to prove it? Prove it is going to be really where it's all at. To get your ESG rating, you're going to need to prove it. And companies simply aren't in a position currently to be able to prove that they have got systems in place that will get them there. And part of ESG is to try and set up a system in which you're going to need to collect the information that will prove it. If you can't prove it, you'll have a lack of credibility and you will not get a good ESG rating. You also saw that the different rating agencies are producing different systems for giving you a rating. And there's some risk in here that if you go with one particular rating agency, you'll get a high ESG score. And if you pick another one, you will get a low one. So will you end up cherry picking your rating agency? Without any standards, this is a problem that we're going to be facing with. And again, that comes down to credibility. We have quickly evolving metrics and weights as the environmental issues that we face change and our understanding of them changes. We keep finding out new things all the time. So there's a lot of volatility in there. And I feel that in the data that we're going to collect is going to be constantly evolving. And I think because of the great complexity we're facing and the changes that are going to come, we will inevitably be faced with incomplete data and possibly compliance failure as a result. And I also think that some of the metric rules are going to end up being quite unrealistic, like water usage. It's not just one single metric. It depends on the environment in which you're working. So water usage in southern Spain, which is quite desiccated, versus water usage in Ireland, which is inundated. These are they must be very different. So you have to be thinking of metrics in terms of location and context. And I wonder whether this is going to be something that's going to be really achieved. So ESG risks, part of ESG risks really are going to be that they don't necessarily reflect, or scores reflect what we're actually doing. So in risk management, I'm going to turn to the sort of risk analysis side of things now. Setting up the analysis. This is how I think that we need to set up analysis in risk management in order to try and address all of these risk management issues, or ESG, environment, social governance issues. And it's not very different from what we're already should be doing. So there are 3 stages to set up the analysis. First of all, you need to, first of all, you need to find the types of impact you care for. Now here I've just got a list of just 6 of them. Financial delays, delays to what you're trying to produce, health and safety, reputation, strategic, environmental. So these are, you may have many, you may have 20, 30 different categories of impact that you care about. So they could be something like amount of CO2 production, whatever. Once you've set those up, you need to define your risk tolerance to each of these individual things. Now, if you have a corporate structure, your risk tolerance can be at the corporate entity owning level. You should be putting in your tolerance for what you consider to be an acceptable, a medium level of impact, a catastrophic level of impact for, say, CO2 production or release or whatever. So you set up a corporate level, the individual statements about what would be an acceptable versus unacceptable versus catastrophic. So a risk-based approach to thinking about impacts. And you do the same thing at the financial level. Now, if you do that, you talk about essentially equivalence between them. So it's not saying that the financial loss is equivalent to the environmental loss, but is saying that we would consider both of these to be catastrophic. If you put that together, you can come up with something equivalent to basically a utility curve that covers all of these different things. And you can use them quantitatively, you can use them qualitatively. So for social issues, it would be perhaps a bit more qualitative. For those metrics that you can measure, be quantitative. So step 2 is to set up these sets of targets of what you would consider to be catastrophic or a very high level of impact, etc., etc. And then step 3, you have to define the different ways that you want to aggregate risk. So you may want to aggregate risks by region. You might want to aggregate them by different types of process or different types of product, etc. By having different categories in which you can map your consequences to your financial, your social, your environmental consequences, you will be able to end up looking at where all of those risks are really concentrated. If we do that, it turns out that you can now compare treatment costs against that nominal aggregate scaling. So I'll talk about that in a little minute. But it means that essentially, when we have your controls, we can figure out which of our controls that we will put in place, the things that we want to do, are going to bring us to the greatest amount of value, and which will bring no value at all. To understand the controls, I need to explain to you a little bit about quantitative bowtie diagrams. So a bowtie diagram is a way of understanding the story that leads you from why a risk might occur to the risk actually occurring to the consequences that come out of that risk. So we start from the left-hand side, moving to the right, and you can think of this in either logical or temporal order. We have a driver, a control, a risk event, mitigation, and a consequence. The risk event here is that the car crashes. That's in the center. Why does the car crash at the driver? Because there's an icy road. That's on the left. And what's the consequence of that car crashing? That's passengers are injured, which is shown on the right. Now, if we were to see those 3 points together, the point we lost control, who would experience what pain and how much, and how this could happen. It allows us to start thinking about strategy. How could we prevent that from occurring? Okay, and obviously the first thing we could do is we could put in winter tires. That will stop us or help reduce the probability of having a car crash given the icy roads. And if we do have a car crash, how could we prevent passengers being injured? Well, these are mitigations. These are airbags and seatbelts. They reduce the probability or the magnitude of the impact of the passengers injured. And of course, far better is prevention rather than cure. So we would focus primarily, if we can, on controls rather than on mitigations. Now, in itself, this is already, I think, very beneficial because it enforces the logical structure of why is it that something might happen and what are the consequences that will come from it. What I typically see in risk registers is the lack of discipline about thinking what is the reason, what is the actual point at which you lost control, what is the consequence. People tend to put these all jumbled together in one risk statement. So passengers might be injured when the car crashes on an icy road. Where it becomes interesting with bow ties is to look at multiple different reasons why you might have that risk event and multiple different consequences that can occur. So on the left-hand side, we have icy roads, going too fast, heavy rain, and distracted by the phone. Now, all of these three things could end up leading to a car crash, and each one of them has a different control, different ways of stopping, going too fast. We might have an alarm on our car or our truck that beeps if we're going too fast, as I have mine. Heavy rain, we might have to go and renew our wipers regularly so that we can see. Distracted by the phone, putting a Bluetooth connection in your car, etc., etc. So these can all help to prevent the car crash. And at the other end, how can we reduce the magnitude of the consequence? So we've already dealt with passengers being injured, but maybe down here, car repairs, we would take insurance out to reduce the magnitude of the financial impact on us from the car crash. And you can see we've got three quite different types of consequence, all which can come from that same risk event. Bow ties are far simpler to use because we have what would otherwise typically be considered as 4 times 3, that's 12 different risks in our risk register. But actually we're looking at they're all form part of one single system. It means, for example, that this control over here, the excess speed alarm, that helps prevent all of these three different consequences. Just as insurance reduces magnitude of impact from 4 different reasons why you might have a car crash. Bow ties are great because they help with communication. You can see it visually, you can understand it. It helps to us to organize. For example, here we can see that we've got some controls in gray. These haven't been done yet, or they're in the process. Others in red, that's not working, and others in green, they're working, they're operating perfectly. And it's actually good for analysis too, because we can assign numbers to these things. So when we assign numbers, then we can start talking about efficiencies. There are other things that we can end up doing with bow tie analysis. So if you have a many-to-many mapping, then you can see here, for example, some kind of process that could be a manufacturing process with all sorts of different risks that can come out of that and all sorts of different consequences. And perhaps some of these will be environmental consequences or reputational consequences. You can see that if we use this as a driver, more we produce a particular type of product, the more risk we have for these different types of consequence, then we can start talking about what's the total amount of risk or impact that we have from this individual process. We can also look the other way around. We can look at a particular consequence. We might have many different products that we manufacture, for example, all which have some risk of leading to some particular type of pollution. Well, we can look at the aggregate effect of that pollution from all of these different products that we produce because of these different risks. You'll notice in here, we've got numbers. And numbers means that we can add it all up. This is something you cannot do if you use a qualitative system. So we can now, if we have a quantitative system and a bow tie kind of analysis, we can also look at how a risk is a driver for another risk. We can look at the effects of individual controls in a much more aggregate fashion. So, for example, this control over here is not working. Currently, it hasn't been checked. It's not really compliant with our processes. Well, what is the impact of that? The impact is that it is now no longer protecting us from 1, 2, 3 different sets of consequences. So we can consider the value of this control, which may not have been particularly enormous if we had been looking only at these individual consequences over here. But now, because of the sequence of different effects that this control is protecting against, we can see that the value of this control is much larger. And that enables us to think about which controls we really should prioritize. Clearly, this is a control we should get back in line because of the amount of protection it's affording us. I keep talking about quantification. Why do we do quantification? It's really about trying to understand the big picture. You cannot understand the big picture. In other words, you cannot add things if you do not have numbers. You cannot add red, yellows, and green colored risks. You cannot add these scoring systems, severity scoring systems that people use in risk matrices. There is no rules for adding them at all. So we need to use quantification. There's a product that we have in my company called Archer Insight. But what we do is we look at the individual strategies that I was mentioning before. So what are our strategic goals? For example, our strategic goal here is an EBITDA of 3.2 billion by the end of the financial year. Okay, and it's got a risk of failure. This risk of failure, 23%. Where does that come from? Well, we see that these tactics that we're using for that particular strategic goal, there are 3 of them. And this one is primarily the strategic goal or the tactic that's going to fail. It's unlikely, or there's some significant chance we won't get into the European, Middle East, and Africa market. Why not? Well, when we click through that, we can see that it's primarily driven by environmental damage risks. And we click through that, we can go and look at each of the individual risks and which are the ones that we should be considering. And as a result, which ones that we need to manage and which controls we need to put in place, etc. So drill down through these risks, figure out which ones are most important. And I think that this is a very good way of looking at risk management. We're looking from what are the primary purposes of our business, and hopefully to include the broader stakeholder group rather than just purely monetary. And then look at how those strategic goals of ours, like reduction in carbon emissions or whatever it is, how they might be achieved, what are the tactics, which tactics will fail, and what are the risks that will create that failure. And these risks, by the way, these tactics, they could be failing because of an aggregation. Could be not one individual carbon emission event. It could be the aggregation of a whole lot of different events. So we can set thresholds around if this tactic this will fail if we have more than X in emissions, and then we'll look at the aggregation of all the different risks and see what the emissions would look like, add it all up, and say, well, there's a decent chance that this is going to fail then. It also means, because we can add stuff together, excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold, so apologies for the snuffling. So we also have an ability now to compare across different entities. So if you've added on that sort of scoring system that I already explained to you with the appetites, we can look at where our risks are really concentrated. We're expanding beyond the purely financial. We're looking at compliance and delay, health, environmental damage, and any different types of metrics you want. Financial, of course, health and safety, perhaps, reputation, strategic. Here you can see our environmental risk is as big as our financial one. You can see our health and safety is off the scale. This we can only do with aggregation again. We can also see that according to what we value, our controls are working effectively or not. So here we see only half of our controls by value are working effectively, meaning not just the number of controls that are working or not working, It's the ones that we're really relying on. So they're weighted by the amount of protection that they're giving us. We can see just how successful we're being. Now, everybody loves a heat map. But if you have well, I say Alexei Sidorenko doesn't. I'm hoping to change his opinion on that. So in the heat map, there are a few major issues with heat maps. So if you've read any of my articles on LinkedIn, you will know that. And this kind of heat map, which I have an article on LinkedIn that you can read. So you can actually create these in your spreadsheet if you want. You can download the file, etc. This is a much more realistic way of looking at heat maps. So we can't really get away from the idea that there are different types of measures of consequence. So, and some of them cannot be completely quantified, and others can. So, health and safety issues, certainly, it's very difficult to quantify that. Whereas you can look at, say, carbon emissions, the amount of emissions. This could be attached to a number. Financial can be attached to a number, etc. But we do need some consistent scale. And I've already mentioned to you how we can achieve that scale while we're setting up our limits, what would be considered to be, for example, an aggregate or individual low impact, a high, medium, etc., very high, catastrophic. And here what we've got is something a bit different. And we are going to need to achieve this if we want to look at environmental and social risk. This is a scale of likelihood, but you'll notice it doesn't go from 0 to 1, it extends beyond that. Because there are some things that can occur multiple times. We need to include the possibility of inclusion happening multiple times. Apologies. Now, you'll see there's a little tadpole line attached to these. The tadpole line shows what the risk looked like before and after we've applied controls and mitigations. Now, if it's reducing likelihood, we're just seeing the controls, the effect of reducing the chances of that risk event occurring. So our likelihood is reduced here. But we can also have systems where we are looking at consequence, both the likelihood being reduced and the magnitude of the consequence being reduced. So here we can see, for example, health and safety, this risk here. We're relying on this quite a lot because we've managed to reduce the likelihood a little bit, but we've also used mitigations to reduce the consequence a great deal, from somewhere up and very high to somewhere near very low. Now, it's the length of this tadpole, if you like, where it comes from, that tells us the difference between, some people call it inherent, or you call it unmanaged risk, and residual unmanaged risk. It's the length of these lines that will help us in the future in auditing risks and how we're controlling them. So we know that we need to focus on those ones where the tadpole line starts somewhere in the more dangerous regions and ends up in the less dangerous region, because unless these controls and mitigations are really in place, our actual risk is somewhere in the higher region, not where we're hoping it to be. And you can see what we're able to do now. We don't just simply look at financial risk, which are in red. We're able to consider all the other types of risks, the reputational risks, for example, or the health and safety, or the environmental risks. And unless we have some consistent framework for being able to compare all different types of risks, then we're never really going to achieve our environmental goals, because we will not be able to make an apples and apples comparison. At the same time, of course, we always need to consider financial risk, because if your corporation, your business is not making some kind of profit, then it's not going to be around to be able to help us get through this ecological crisis we're facing, environmental crisis. So we need to be able to look at the aggregate financial losses as well as everything else. And the Monte-Carlo simulation, I'm a very strong advocate for putting together all of the risk with all the interconnections, the interconnected drivers and the connections between one risk and another, and looking at the total financial exposure. And only then can we see, we can't look at them on an individual basis, we need to look at them in aggregate, because then we can see whether or not we have sufficient reserves or sufficient insurance, for example, to be able to cover the risk. Or perhaps we got even more insurance than we need and we can save ourselves some money. So if we are able to look at the total losses distribution we have from all of our risks, it also means that we can then drill down and ask ourselves, and what are the individual biggest risks? So in terms of expected loss, which is the mean, this is the largest risk, and we should be focusing on those to try and consider how we can reduce our financial risk exposure. And if you remember, I talked about categorizing consequences in a number of different ways. You can also do the same thing for risk, or you can do the same thing for drivers. If you do this, then and you use quantification, then it allows you to slice and dice in different ways. So you can, for example, look at the total amount of CO2 emissions by different types of product, or different business lines, or different locations. So, for example, here, Belgium's 5% of our market, 40% of our CO2 emission. Maybe it's time to stop doing business in Belgium. I say that, I'm living in Belgium. So by aggregating, by quantifying, we're always able to make a more informed decision. And it's important, in my view, that we don't look at quantification of risk as an endpoint in itself. It's really just it's a method for us to get to more informed information about risk that will help us make more informed decisions. So quantification, if there was a way of not doing quantification and achieving the same level of understanding about the risk we face, I'd be all for that, but there isn't. So unfortunately, we all have to really just bite this bullet and think about quantification as an absolute minimum. So I'm Vice President of Archer Risk Management. So I have a little plug for Archer. Here is my email address, david.vose@archerirm.com. You're very welcome to contact me if you wish and have a discussion. Our products, we have two products, one that's come out, or two that come out. One is called Archer Insight, which is about quantification. You've seen some of those screenshots. You don't need to use this in order, Archer Insight, to be able to do quantitative risk analysis. If you want to actually make it into a process that your entire corporation follows, you're going to need to do something like that. You can't do it on a spreadsheet. And we also have Archer ESG, which is environmental and social governance product. And the intention of that is to help you collect all of that diverse and complicated information so that you can, on environmental issues, ESG issues, so that you can combine it together with Archer Insight and make more informed decisions. And we actually have a number of other innovations that are coming up in the near future. So you might like to consider looking at the archerirm.com website from time to time, because you'll see some very interesting things coming up. So I thank you very much for your time. And I wish you a very good rest of your conference. Thank you.